Iron birds once carved streaks of fire across the European sky. Their cockpits carried men in black leather jackets and iron confidence, sworn heirs of the Luftwaffe. But on a cold spring morning in 1943, the same men sat hunched and silent on the splintered benches of a train car rattling across the American Midwest. They were German pilots, once masters of altitude and thunder, now reduced to prisoners of war, their wings clipped, their fate unknown. Outside the windows, fields rolled endlessly seas of corn and wheat under the watch of wooden silos. For men raised in a Europe where farmland shrank beneath bombing and hunger, the sheer abundance of soil itself felt like a humiliation. The air smelled different. It was not the odor of burning fuel or scorched cities, but the faint sweetness of grain. Farmers, not soldiers, waited at the next station, denim overalls, sunburned skin, hands calloused by soil instead of steel. The pilots expected jeers, or perhaps fists, at the very least, the cold indifference owed to an enemy. Instead, what awaited them was stranger than hostility. A farmer's wife carried a basket wrapped in cloth, the steam rising even before she reached the platform. The first loaf appeared before them like a hallucination. Cornbread, golden and thick, cut into generous squares, still breathing heat. To the prisoners, it was absurd. Bread. Real bread. Not these sawdust-streaked loaves of wartime Berlin, but warm, fragrant, fresh from the oven. They looked at one another in disbelief. Oberleutnant Hans Keller, who had flown dozens of missions over the English Channel, later wrote in his diary that this single loaf carried more shock than any barrage of flak. It was the first time, he confessed, that I doubted everything we had been told about these people. The bread was passed hand to hand, each pilot hesitating as though touching a forbidden object. Hunger overpowered hesitation, teeth broke into the crust, and steam spilled out like captured sunlight. With every bite came a flood of memories, ration lines in Munich, mothers trading rings for potatoes, officers eating gray soup in silence. The shame was sharper than the hunger, yet it was also undeniable. The enemy, whom their officers had sworn was decadent and weak, could produce more bread for its captives than Germany could feed its own children. The contradiction burned, and in that silence, that tense, almost unbearable silence, as German pilots chewed the bread of their enemies, something invisible cracked. The train doors slid open with a groan, and the captured pilots stepped onto the platform. The sky above the American Midwest stretched in a blue so wide it seemed without end. No air raid sirens, no smoke drifting from chimneys starved of coal, no ruins. Only silence, broken by the chirp of sparrows and the low hum of cicadas hiding in the fields. The Germans looked around uneasily, their boots clattering against wood planks worn by farmers' feet. For men who had flown through fire, this quiet felt unnatural, even menacing. They waited for the spectacle of vengeance. After all, propaganda had promised them that captured enemies would be spit upon, perhaps struck, maybe starved. Instead, they were met by figures that seemed almost ordinary. American farmers, men with broad shoulders, plaid shirts rolled to the elbow, straw hats tilted against the sun. No military arrogance, no shouts of victory, just the calm presence of men who lived by the rhythm of seasons, not battlefields. Some held baskets, others carried tin pitchers of milk. For a long moment, neither side spoke. A handful of pilots instinctively straightened their posture, expecting humiliation, but none came. One farmer approached, his hands rough and darkened by sun, his eyes lined not with hatred but with curiosity. He extended a hand not for shaking, but simply to lower the basket in front of the prisoners. A faint smile crossed his face, not mocking, not triumphant, but almost apologetic. As though to say, "We know you are hungry." It was an image impossible to reconcile with the words of their officers. The Luftwaffe had painted Americans as crude and soulless, a nation of factory machines with no culture and no honor. Yet here were men who bore no weapons, who did not even look like soldiers, quietly offering food as though it were the most natural act in the world. One of the younger pilots, barely 20, whispered under his breath in disbelief. He had expected barbed insults, maybe a blow across the face. Instead, he saw a farmer's daughter, no older than his sister in Cologne. standing shyly with her hands clasped, watching the men in gray uniforms with the nervous kindness reserved for strangers. For the prisoner, it was unbearable. He turned his head, ashamed that her gaze met his hollow eyes. This was not weakness, though it looked like mercy. It was power, a subtle, unspoken power, the kind that did not need to shout or dominate, but expressed itself in abundance and calm. The farmers knew they had nothing to fear from these gaunt young men. They had no need to prove superiority. Their fields already said everything. And as the prisoners stood before their enemies, they realized that this was no performance, no staged propaganda. It was simple, almost too simple, men and women accustomed to feeding, not to punishing, and in that plain gesture, the pilots began to sense the enormity of the truth pressing down on them, that they had stepped into a world entirely different from the one their leaders had promised. The first loaf appeared as though conjured from a dream. A farmer's wife unwrapped the cloth, and golden steam rolled into the cool air. The smell alone struck the German pilots harder than any interrogation could. Cornbread rich, moist, with its crust still warm from the oven, was laid out on a rough wooden table. The prisoners froze. For men accustomed to chewing on black bread laced with sawdust, or watery soup stretched with turnips, this was no ordinary sight. It was a revelation. The younger pilots shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward their captors, wondering if this was some kind of cruel trick. Perhaps the bread was poisoned. Perhaps it was bait. But hunger gnawed too deep to resist. Oberleutnant Hans Keller, the same officer who had written of his disbelief in his diary, hesitated only for a moment before breaking off a piece. The steam kissed his fingertips. He bit into the crust. The sweetness of corn spread across his tongue, and he closed his eyes as if bracing for punishment. Instead, the only consequence was more hunger. This was not bread meant for prisoners. This was the kind of bread that farmers' children ate at supper, dipped in butter, washed down with cold milk. Yet here it was, offered to men who had bombed Allied cities, who had dropped fire across the English coast. Even the guards looked on without urgency. It was as though the act of feeding an enemy required no explanation. The pilots exchanged looks. Some laughed bitterly. Others stared at the ground. One muttered a curse, ashamed to feel gratitude toward the very people he had been trained to despise. Another, younger and less guarded, whispered that it tasted like the bread of peace. His bunkmate shot him a warning glance, but no one argued. Silence hung over them, thick as smoke, broken only by the crunch of crust between teeth. For Germany in 1943, cornbread was unimaginable luxury. By that year, food rationing had cut per-person calories to levels that starved children and left even officers gaunt. Reports told of families boiling weeds, of butter disappearing entirely from shops, of sugar reserved only for the military elite. A single loaf of sweet, steaming cornbread, placed casually on a table in the heart of America, carried more weight than statistics. It was a living contrast, one that could not be denied. A pilot remembered his wife writing from Hamburg she had waited 6 hours in line for 2 eggs. Another thought of his mother's letter, apologizing for sending no package because there was nothing left to send. Each bite of cornbread was not only nourishment, it was comparison, cruel and undeniable. They were not beaten with whips. They were not mocked or starved. Instead, they were confronted with generosity so ordinary it was unbearable. And as the sweet taste lingered in their mouths, they realized the cornbread was not just food. It was proof of a world stronger, richer, and utterly beyond their reach. For the pilots, the warmth of the bread quickly turned into a sting. Every bite carried not only sweetness, but humiliation. Pride, once their armor, began to crumble with the crust between their teeth. They thought of Germany, their homeland where mothers scoured empty shops and children fell asleep to the sound of hunger. Even the high officers, cloaked in medals and authority, ate thin slices of gray bread and watered stew, parceled out by ration stamps that never stretched far enough. The memory struck harder than chains here in America. The enemy's prisoners were eating what their own children could not. Oberfeldwebel Dieter Weiss, who had flown escort over Stalingrad, later wrote to his brother, "We expected to be spit on. Instead, we ate as if we were honored guests." I could not look at the loaf without thinking of father at home, chewing in silence on bread that tasted of paper. The shame was worse than the hunger. His words were smuggled in a censored letter, but preserved in the camp archive, a raw testament to the weight of that first encounter. The pilots exchanged glances across the long wooden table. No words were needed. Their silence spoke louder than their uniforms. They realized, almost in unison, that their nation, so proud, so sure of its destiny, was already outmatched in the most fundamental way. America did not need to parade its victories. The smell of fresh cornbread rising from a farmhouse kitchen said everything. Beyond the camp's barbed wire, endless fields whispered the same truth. Corn stretched farther than the eye could follow. A wealth of food that dwarfed entire German provinces. A single harvest here could outfeed a city back home. The men thought of their propaganda posters, showing a mighty Reich feeding its people through discipline and power. Those posters now felt like lies drawn on paper, brittle and absurd compared to the steaming bread in their hands. And yet, it was not only abundance that humiliated them, it was kindness. A kindness unasked for, one that disarmed them more than bullets. To be treated not as criminals or monsters, but simply as hungry men, struck at the core of their identity. It was as if their captors were saying, your nation may have conquered lands, but it cannot conquer the ordinary decency of strangers who feed even their enemies. Night fell that day with the smell of bread still lingering in the barracks. Some pilots lay awake, staring at the rafters, the taste of corn and shame refusing to fade. The hum of cicadas outside the wire seemed to mock them. For all their training, for all their victories in the skies, they had no defense against this quiet truth here. In captivity, they had eaten better than at home. Night inside the camp carried its own kind of silence, broken only by murmurs and the scratching of pens on cheap paper, by regulation. The prisoners were allowed to write letters censored, of course, but still a lifeline to the world beyond the barbed wire. It was here, in those cramped words, that the fractures began to show. The cornbread had not only filled their stomachs, it had lodged itself into their thoughts, forcing them to question what had been hammered into their minds since training. Lieutenant Karl Reinhardt wrote to his wife in Bremen, "They give us bread here that is yellow, sweet, and warm. I thought at first it was a trick, but it is simply how they live. I do not know how to tell you this without sounding like I'm mocking our hardship, but even as prisoners we eat better than our families at home." The letter, intercepted by censors, was later copied into American intelligence files, considered valuable evidence of ideological erosion. Not every man dared write so openly. Some whispered their doubts in the dim light of the barracks, only to be silenced by older officers who still clung to pride. Arguments broke out. A few swore that the bread was just bait, a tactic to soften their resolve. Others pointed out the obvious: if this was bait, it was better than anything their homeland had provided in months. In one corner of the hut, two young pilots quarreled so loudly that a guard had to step in. Their anger was not at the Americans, but at each other, one refusing to believe, the other refusing to pretend. Even gossip began to take shape, carried from bunk to bunk. Rumors spread that a captured pilot had seen a factory worker's lunch pail, packed with thick sandwiches, an apple, and a slice of cake. The man had almost wept on the spot. Another claimed that farmers fed their livestock more grain than German families could dream of. Whether truth or exaggeration, the whispers traveled fast, fueling envy and despair. The contradictions weighed heavily. Here was proof, laid out in bread and butter, that the Reich's propaganda was false. The question lingered in every mind if they had been lied to about America. What else had they been lied to about? The cornbread became more than food. It became evidence, impossible to ignore, gnawing at their confidence as surely as hunger once had. Some prisoners found themselves staring at the bread not with gratitude, but resentment. It mocked them, reminding them of what their own nation could not give. And in that resentment, truth pressed harder. The cornbread was not a weapon of cruelty, yet it destroyed illusions more efficiently than bombs. I want to pause here and ask you, the audience, if you were in their place, sitting behind wire, tasting bread that revealed your world had been a lie, would you embrace the truth or cling to pride? Share your thoughts in the comments. Days turned into weeks, and the first shock of capture gave way to routine. The pilots were marched to labor assignments. Some helped mend fences, others tended fields under supervision. Yet even in work, reminders of abundance were everywhere. Rows of corn rose like walls of green, taller than a man, stretching farther than the horizon. The prisoners who once maneuvered Messerschmitts at dizzying speeds now found themselves staring in awe at something as simple as food, growing in impossible plenty. The Reich had drilled into them that America was weak, lazy, decadent, but each day chipped away at that story. They saw women driving tractors, black workers operating machinery with confidence, teenagers unloading sacks of grain heavier than most men could carry. None of this fit the caricature painted back home. It was not weakness they saw, but a strength that did not need uniforms or parades. By autumn of 1943, statistics told the same truth their eyes could not ignore. America was producing nearly 90 million tons of wheat a year, while Germany's yields had collapsed under bombing and requisitioning. In a single month, U.S. factories turned out more aircraft than Germany could build in half a year. These numbers trickled into the camps through newspapers, but they hardly needed papers. The food on their plates and the milk in their cups were statistics made flesh. And so, ideology crumbled, often in silence. A guard recalled one prisoner whispering, almost to himself, "We were fools. A nation that can feed its enemies is not weak." It was not defiance, not surrender, but the dawning recognition of reality. For some, it was unbearable. For others, it was a strange kind of relief, as though they no longer had to cling to a myth that had betrayed them. In the barracks, late at night, younger men dared to speak more openly. They asked questions, not about when the war would end, but about what kind of country could live this way. Was it true, they wondered, that American workers owned cars, that farm families sent their children to school instead of to the fields? A few even speculated, half in jest, half in envy, that perhaps it was better to lose to such an enemy than to win with starvation. These whispers unsettled the older officers, who clung desperately to the party line. They warned against softness, against being deceived, but the evidence was overwhelming, and no speech could silence what bread and fields had already proven. Let me ask you directly, if you had spent your life believing your nation was unmatched, only to discover its enemy outproduced and outfed you at every turn, how would you carry that truth? Would you admit it aloud, or bury it in silence? I'd love to hear your reflections in the comments. By the winter of 1945, the war was almost over. News traveled slowly through the barbed wire, carried by scraps of newspapers, half-heard radio broadcasts, and the weary expressions of guards who no longer pretended victory was in doubt. For the German pilots, the camp had become less a prison than a mirror. They had entered as warriors certain of destiny, but they would leave as men burdened by memory. Some wrote in diaries that later survived the war. One pilot described his dreams not of dogfights over the channel, but of a loaf of bread steaming on a farmhouse table. Another confessed that he feared returning home more than he had feared combat. "What will we bring back?" he asked in his journal. Not medals, not triumphs, but stories of abundance, of enemies who gave us bread while our own children starved. His words captured the weight of their dilemma to speak. The truth was to expose the Reich's lies, yet to stay silent was to carry the shame alone. The final months in the camp were filled with contradictions. Some men volunteered for farm work simply to spend more time in the fields, inhaling the scent of earth that seemed richer than anything they had known in Europe. Others avoided the sight, unable to bear the humiliation of knowing that their homeland could not match this simple prosperity. At night, the barracks hummed with speculation about what awaited them after release. Would they return to ruins? Would anyone believe their stories of bread, milk, and fields that fed even the enemy? When liberation came, it was quiet. The gates opened, the guards stepped aside, and trains once again carried the men across the vast distances of America. But this time, the fields passing outside the windows were not just scenery, they were symbols, etched into memory. Every acre whispered of a truth impossible to erase, that the strength of America lay not only in its factories and armies, but in its ability to feed both friend and foe. For many, the taste of cornbread never left. It lingered as a reminder that wars are not only fought with guns and bombs, but also with the silent weapons of abundance and dignity. The bread had humbled them more deeply than defeat in the sky ever could. And so, when the men finally returned to a broken Germany, they carried back with them not just stories of captivity, but a quiet testimony that their enemy's greatest weapon had been kindness wrapped in ordinary bread. It was a truth bitter to swallow, yet impossible to deny. The story of the German pilots and the cornbread is not just a fragment of wartime memory, it is a parable of contrasts. Men who once soared through the sky, engines roaring with the promise of dominance, found themselves seated on wooden benches, humbled by something as ordinary as bread. What began as a shock on a train platform in 1943 became a thread woven through their captivity, a reminder that power is not always loud, nor measured by destruction, but sometimes revealed in the quiet act of feeding an enemy. Years after the war, some of these men confessed that they could never forget the smell of cornbread. It haunted them more than the sound of flak guns or the sight of burning cities. One recalled in old age that he would dream of rivet guns pounding in distant American factories, a rhythm that seemed endless, unstoppable. Another admitted that whenever he saw a loaf of bread, he remembered his shame in realizing that the enemy's prisoners ate better than Germany's children. These recollections show us how war lingers not just in wounds or ruins, but in memories of small, human gestures that carry unbearable weight. It is tempting to measure victory by battles won or territory gained, but perhaps the deeper victories are the ones that do not announce themselves in headlines. The farmers who handed over that bread may not have thought of themselves as warriors, but they carried a weapon stronger than iron, the ability to make their captives taste both nourishment and truth. For the prisoners, each bite was a lesson, each crumb a reminder that strength rooted in abundance and humanity cannot easily be defeated. And so we are left with an image, a simple loaf of cornbread, steam rising in the morning air, placed between enemies, one hand giving, another trembling as it receives. In that moment lies a history more enduring than dogfights or speeches, the history of how kindness, unassuming yet relentless, can shatter illusions and outlast the sound of war.